On April 1945, where the noise of the greatest conflict in human history is fading into a haunting silence. Yet in the shadows of the Bohemian forests, a different kind of war is just beginning. General George S. Patton and Colonel Charles Reed were about to gamble their careers and the lives of their men on an illegal raid deep behind Soviet lines. Their target wasn't a Nazi bunker or a hidden rocket, but a mission so singular it would risk an international incident with the Soviet Union. On April 28, 1945, the mission began. Was it for gold or secret weapons or the leaders of the Reich? No, it was for a legend that had survived 4 centuries. The date is April 26, 1945, and the European theater is a landscape of absolute ruin, where the morality of men has been ground into the dirt by 6 years of industrial slaughter. In the final weeks of the war, the men of the 2nd Cavalry Group, known to the Germans as the ghosts of Patton's army, were pushing deep into the borderlands between Bavaria and Czechoslovakia. These were not your average soldiers. They were a mechanized unit that had traded their literal horses for armored scout cars and M24 Chevy light tanks. Yet the spirit of the old cavalry still ran through their veins. Colonel Charles Hank Reed, the group's commander, was a man who lived and breathed the equestrian arts, a leader who understood that while wars are won with steel, civilization is built on heritage. As Reed's units accepted the surrender of a specialized German intelligence staff known as the Gruppe Gehlen, a discovery was made that would shift the tactical focus of the entire Third Army. Captain Ferdinand Sperl, an intelligence officer, found a collection of photographs in a captured Luftwaffe colonel's briefcase that seemed out of place in a war zone. They were not maps or troop movements, they were professional portraits of snow-white stallions performing the airs above the ground, the high-level dressage of the Spanish riding school in Vienna. Reed looked at these images and realized he wasn't just looking at animals. He was looking at a genetic treasure that the Nazis had kidnapped from across Europe. The truth was far more sinister than a simple theft, for the Nazis had established a secret stud farm in the Czechoslovakian town of Hostau under the direction of Dr. Gustav Rau, the Third Reich's chief of breeding. Rau was a man obsessed with the same twisted eugenics that fueled the Holocaust, but his focus was the Aryan horse. He had gathered over 1,200 of the finest equines in the world, including 375 irreplaceable Lipizzaners and 100 pure-blood Polish Arabians, intending to breed a super horse that would reflect the supposed purity of the master race. To Reed, this was a biological crime against history, and he knew that as the Soviet Red Army swept in from the east, these horses would likely end up in a Russian cooking pot. The dilemma was agonizing because Hostau lay 20 miles behind the official Allied stop line, inside territory destined for Soviet occupation, according to the Yalta Agreement. If Reed crossed that line, he wasn't just fighting Germans, he was defying the orders of the Supreme Allied Command and risking a hot war with Stalin. But the clock was ticking, and the reports from the farm were grim. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Rudowski, the commandant at Hostau, was caught between his oath to a dying Führer and his duty as a veterinarian to protect his charges from the starving refugees and the approaching Soviet tanks. The fear was not hypothetical, for the Soviet army marched on its stomach, and they had already slaughtered the entire Royal Hungarian Lipizzaner herd in Budapest for meat. When the German veterinarian Captain Rudolf Lessing slipped across the lines under a flag of truce to meet with the Americans, the desperation was palpable. He told Reed that if the Americans didn't act within 48 hours, the most ancient horse breed in Europe would cease to exist. Reed didn't hesitate. He bypassed the traditional chain of command and went straight to the one man he knew would understand. Old blood and guts himself, General George S. Patton. Patton was a man of contradictions, a warrior who loved the violence of the charge, but who had also competed in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing 5th in the equestrian event. He viewed himself as a modern-day knight, and when Reed presented the plan to rescue the Lipizzaners, Patton gave a characteristically blunt order. Get them. Make it fast. This wasn't just a military objective for Patton. It was an act of chivalry in a war that had seen very little of it. He knew the political risk was immense, but he also knew that all glory is fleeting, and saving the white stallions would be a legacy that outlived the conquest of any city. The man chosen to lead the tactical edge of this mission was Captain Thomas M. Stewart, a 29-year-old Tennessee native and the son of a U.S. Senator. Stewart was lanky, intelligent, and a master horseman who spoke enough German to negotiate through the barrel of a gun. On the night of April 26, Stewart and the German veterinarian Lessing did something truly surreal. They crossed back into enemy territory on a motorcycle, navigating the pitch-black forests of Bohemia to reach Hostau. They were entering a hornet's nest of retreating Wehrmacht units and fanatical SS detachments who were still executing traitors for even thinking of surrender. Inside Hostau, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of wet hay and the cold dread of the gallows. Stewart found himself face to face with General Weissenberger, a commander who was horrified that his subordinates were negotiating with the enemy. The tension in that room was a microcosm of the entire war. The Germans wanted an honorable way out, and Stewart had to convince them that surrendering to the Americans was the only way to save the horses and their own lives from the Soviet retribution. He laid out a plan. The Americans would stage a fake attack with light tanks to provide the Germans the cover of being overwhelmed, allowing them to surrender without being shot by their own side. As the sun rose on April 28th, the Ghosts prepared for their most unusual combat operation. Task Force Reed was a lean, lethal collection of 325 men, supported by M8 scout cars and the fast-moving M24 Chevy light tanks. They weren't just fighting for ground, they were moving into a political vacuum where the lines on the map were blurring by the hour. The 12th Corps unleashed a thunderous artillery barrage on German defensive positions along the border, not to destroy them, but to suppress them long enough for the task force to slip through the gap and race toward Hostau. The drive was 20 miles of pure adrenaline through territory teeming with the 11th Panzer Division and remnants of the SS. Every turn in the road could have brought a Panzerfaust or an 88mm anti-tank gun, but the cavalry moved with the aggressive speed that had made them Patton's favorites. When the American armor finally rolled into the town square of Hostau, they weren't met with machine gun fire, but with salutes from German soldiers who had decided that the survival of the Lipizzaners was more important than the survival of the Reich. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Captain Stewart quickly realized that his small force of 180 men was now responsible for securing a town, a sprawling stud farm, and over 1,200 animals, while surrounded by tens of thousands of hostile troops. He was deep behind enemy lines, and the Waffen-SS was already mobilizing to take back the farm. Stewart needed more boots on the ground, and he needed them immediately. In a move that would make any military lawyer cringe, he began to recruit a foreign legion from the very people he had just liberated. First, he turned to the Allied POWs who had been working as laborers at the farm, a mix of British, New Zealanders, French, and Poles who were eager for revenge and a rifle. Next, he did the unthinkable. He rearmed the surrendered Wehrmacht soldiers, allowing them to keep their Mausers and coal scuttle helmets to defend the perimeter. But the most striking addition to this motley crew was a unit of anti-communist Russian Cossacks led by the haughty Prince Amasau. These were men who hated the Soviets with a burning passion and who were perhaps the finest horsemen in the world. Imagine the scene at the Hostau farm. American G is in their olive drab, German Wehrmacht in field gray, and bearded Cossacks in fur hats, all standing shoulder to shoulder behind machine gun nests. They were united by a single desperate goal to protect the white stallions. Stewart, gripping his Thompson submachine gun, knew that the peace was an illusion. The first reports were coming in from his scouts. The 32nd SS Volunteer Grenadier Division was moving through the woods, and they weren't coming to talk. The logistical nightmare was only beginning. Among the 1,200 horses, hundreds were pregnant mares or newborn foals who couldn't survive a forced march. Reed began scouring the area for every truck he could find, both German and American, to transport the most vulnerable animals. He was organizing a retreat that looked more like a circus than a military withdrawal, but he knew the Soviets were less than 30 miles away. If the Red Army reached Hostau first, the standoff would be catastrophic, and the horses would be lost forever. As the first shots of the SS counterattack rang out through the trees, the Foreign Legion braced for impact. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a battle for the very soul of the war's conclusion. Men who had been trying to kill each other for years were now sharing ammunition and rations, looking out over the same fields where the world's most beautiful horses were grazing, unaware that their lives depended on this fragile, impossible alliance. The first assault from the Waffen-SS hit the perimeter on April 30th, 1945, with a ferocity that reminded the battle-weary Gs that the war was far from over. These were die-hard fanatics who viewed the surrender of the stud farm as a supreme act of treason. They didn't care about the 400-year-old bloodlines of the Lipizzaners. They saw only a target. The forest erupted in the staccato rhythm of MG-42s and the sharp cracks of Mauser fire as Stewart's Foreign Legion held the line. In the heat of the firefight, the alliance proved its worth. The German Wehrmacht soldiers, fighting in their own uniforms but under American command, provided a local tactical advantage, knowing the terrain intimately. Meanwhile, the Cossacks under Prince Amaso moved like shadows through the underbrush, their fierce reputation for close-quarters combat keeping the SS infantry at bay. Captain Stewart found himself in the surreal position of coordinating fire for a multinational force that technically shouldn't exist. He moved between the foxholes, shouting orders in a mix of English and broken German, while the M24 Chaffee tanks provided the heavy punch needed to break the SS formations. The battle lasted for 5 brutal hours. It was a chaotic, small-unit struggle where the stakes were measured in hoofbeats. At one point, the SS attempted a flanking maneuver to reach the stables, intending to slaughter the horses out of spite, but they were met by the concentrated fire of Task Force Reed's scout cars. The 32nd SS Division took heavy losses, finding that the ghosts of Patton's army were just as lethal in a defensive stand as they were in a deep strike raid. By the time the SS finally withdrew into the darkening woods, the fields of Hostau were littered with their dead. But the Americans had paid a price. 2 young soldiers, Private First Class Raymond E. Mans and Tech 5 Owen W. Sutton, were killed in the defense of the farm. They were Americans who had survived the horrors of the Western Front only to give their lives in the final days of the war to protect an Austrian cultural treasure. Their sacrifice is often overlooked in the grand history of the war, but in the annals of the 2nd Cavalry, they are remembered as the men who died so that beauty might live. Their deaths added a somber weight to the mission. This was no longer a lighthearted adventure. It was a sacred duty paid for in blood. With the SS repelled but the Soviet T-34s looming on the horizon, Colonel Reed knew they had to move, and they had to move now. He organized what can only be described as a 130-mile Wild West cattle drive through the heart of a war zone. The scene was breathtaking. Hundreds of white stallions and mares being herded by American GIs, German soldiers, and Cossacks, all riding together like a scene from a Hollywood epic. The foals and the heavily pregnant mares were loaded into the back of 2.5-ton trucks, their heads peeking out over the tailgates as the convoy began its dash for the Bavarian border. This was the Cowboy in Operation Cowboy. The GIs, many of whom had grown up on farms in the American Midwest or the South, felt a strange sense of normalcy in the herding. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were guardians. As the massive column of 1,200 horses stretched out along the narrow roads, the logistical friction was immense. They had to navigate around destroyed bridges and through towns still filled with desperate refugees. The air was filled with the sound of thousands of hooves and the shouting of men trying to keep the herds from panicking at the sound of distant artillery. The most dangerous moment came as the column neared the eastern edge of Hostau. Just as the last of the horses was clearing the town, a clatter of steel on cobblestone signaled the arrival of the enemy from the east. Soviet T-34 tanks, caked in the dust of the Russian steppe, rolled into view. This was the moment Patton had feared, a direct standoff between the two superpowers. The American M8 scout cars turned their 37mm guns toward the Soviet tanks, and the T-34s traversed their turrets. For a few heart-stopping minutes, the fate of the post-war world hung in the balance. The Soviet commanders looked at the Americans, then at the massive herd of horses, and then back at the armor. Through a mix of signals and a mutual, unspoken understanding that the war with Germany was the primary goal, the Soviets chose not to engage. They watched with a mix of confusion and stoic indifference as the Americans stole the horses from their allotted zone of influence. The T-34s remained stationary, their engines idling, as the last of the Lipizzaners disappeared into the western horizon. It was a victory for diplomacy through strength, but Reed didn't wait to see if they would change their minds. The journey to the American lines in Bavaria was a grueling test of endurance. The horses were footsore, and the men were exhausted, But the momentum was unstoppable. At the Czechoslovakian border, they faced one last obstacle. Local Czech partisans had erected a barricade, claiming the horses were national property and could not leave. Captain Stewart didn't have time for a legal debate. He ordered his tanks to the front and informed the guards that if the barricade wasn't removed in 60 seconds, he would flatten it. The guards conceded, and the Cowboy drive crossed into the safety of the U.S. zone. By the time the mission was complete, over 1,200 horses had been saved, but the story didn't end at the border. On May 7, 1945, the day Germany officially surrendered, Colonel Alois Podolsky, the director of the Spanish riding school, finally met with General Patton in St. Martin, Austria. Podolsky, not realizing his mares had already been rescued, put on a private performance for Patton and the Undersecretary of War. He stood before Patton on his stallion and made a formal request for the protection of the school and the recovery of his breeding stock. Patton, with a glint in his eye, granted the protection immediately. He then told Podolsky that the ghosts of his army had already handled the matter. When the two men eventually visited the herds together, Patton turned to an aide and remarked how strange it was that in a world on fire, men could still care so much about teaching a horse to wiggle its butt. But behind the humor, Patton was deeply moved. He had helped preserve a lineage that dated back to the Habsburgs, a piece of European culture that the Nazis had tried to pervert and the Soviets would have likely destroyed. The aftermath of Operation Cowboy was bittersweet. While the 244 Lipizzaners were eventually returned to Austria to rebuild the Spanish riding school, the non-Lipizzaner horses faced a more complicated fate. The 100 pureblood Arabians and various thoroughbreds were designated as spoils of war because it was impossible to return them to their original owners in Soviet-occupied Poland and Hungary. In October 1945, 150 of these elite horses were loaded onto the ship Stephen F. Austin and sent to the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic was as chaotic as the rescue itself. The ship hit massive storms, and the stallion, stressed by the journey, broke out of their stalls and engaged in bloody fights on the cargo deck. When they finally arrived in Newport News, Virginia, they were sent to the Army Remount Depot in Front Royal. However, as the U.S. Army rapidly mechanized in the post-war era, the value of these war horses plummeted. Many were eventually auctioned off to private owners, and some, like the stallion Lotnik, suffered years of neglect before being rediscovered by horse lovers who recognized their royal lineage. In Austria, the rescue is remembered with a sense of profound gratitude. The Spanish riding school in Vienna remains the oldest and most prestigious institution of its kind in the world, and every performance of the white stallions today is a direct result of the events in Hostau. Colonel Charles Reed would later write, "We were so tired of death and destruction, we wanted to do something beautiful." It is perhaps the most eloquent explanation for why 300 men would risk everything for a group of animals that didn't speak their language or fight their battles. The ghosts of Patton's army were the eyes and ears of the Third Army, but in the final days of the war, they became the soul of it. They proved that even in the midst of total war, the human spirit is capable of recognizing beauty and choosing to protect it. The sacrifice of Mans and Sutton, the audacity of Stewart, and the vision of Reed created a bridge between the old world of chivalry and the new world of armored warfare. This was World War II, this was General Patton, and this was Operation Cowboy. We are left with a single haunting question. If you were standing at that border in 1945, knowing that a single shot could restart the war, would you have opened the gates? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And remember that sometimes the most important battles are not the ones fought for land, but the ones fought for what makes us human.